What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we are going to be talking about 10 players that you need to pick up and stash on the end of your bench as we head into week 4 of the fantasy football season. As always, if this is your first time here, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Don't want to miss any of the future content that we have coming out later this week. But with all of that being said, let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these waiver wire pickups. All right, so before we get into the top 10 guys on the waiver wire for me this week, I do have a list of players that you should double check and just make sure that they are not available on your waiver wire, because if they are available on the waiver wire, you should be picking them up. All of these guys are going to be either equal or more than 50% owned in those leagues, but it is going to be Deontay Johnson at 74%, Carson Steele, Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, Demarcus Robinson, Quentin Johnston, Chuba Hubbard, Romeo Doubs, Cam Akers, Aaron Rodgers, Jacoby Myers, and Rico Dowdle. So if any of those guys are available on your waiver wire, they should not be on the waiver wire. Make sure you go pick those guys up. But coming in as the first overall player, we will start at the quarterback position. The first guy that I want to talk about is Sam Darnold of the Minnesota Vikings, who is currently rostered in about 38% of leagues, according to Sleeper's ownership percentages. Now, through the first 3 weeks of the season, Darnold, he is averaging about 19.7 fantasy points per game. That's more than guys like Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, CJ Stroud, and many, many more. Now, obviously, this is a very small sample size, but the way that he's been playing right now does make him a player that needs to be picked up and added to every single team, no matter the format that you play in. Now, obviously, Darnold, he did suffer a little bit of an injury scare here in week 3 versus the Texans, but the MRI that he got here today on Monday at the time of this recording did reveal that that was just a bone bruise for Sam Darnold, so he isn't expected to miss any time. But keep in mind, Darnold does have a couple tough matchups piling up here in the next couple of weeks. He gets Green Bay, the Jets, and Detroit. But with that being said, too, San Francisco and Houston were supposed to be tough matchups, and it didn't really matter. He still produced anyway. So Sam Darnold needs to be picked up here at the quarterback position. Now, moving on to the second quarterback that I think you need to pick up, you have to have Justin Fields on your rosters here at this point. He is rostered in only about 27% of leagues. It feels crazy that he's still only rostered in 27% because he has been playing fairly well as the Pittsburgh Steelers starter. Now, he has won this starting job entirely outright, in my opinion. The Steelers are 3-0. It looks like he has taken a step forward in development with the proper coaching finally there for him here at the NFL level. And he has the rushing upside that he possesses that a lot of NFL quarterbacks don't have. And that's a cheat code for us in fantasy football. So he needs to be a player we pick up. The Steelers' upcoming schedule, it's really good for quarterbacks. He has matchups against the Indianapolis Colts, the Dallas Cowboys, and the Las Vegas Raiders, all of which who have been very easy matchups for fantasy football quarterbacks. And they're all currently ranked bottom 10 in the NFL against those quarterbacks. So we could have some bigger games here loading for Justin Fields in our fantasy football leagues. Now let's move over to the running back position. The number one running back that I think you should be picking up is going to be Braelon Allen, currently rostered in about 46% of leagues, and he has very quietly put together a great start to the season. He's seen some steady progression throughout the first 3 weeks, 2 touches in week 1, 9 touches in week 2, and 14 touches in week 3, and he's very quickly becoming one of the most valuable handcuffs in fantasy football with some potential standalone value on the horizon here for the New York Jets. Now, this week is a pretty slow week of waivers. There's not a lot of great assets on the waiver wire here this week just due to not really having a lot of injuries, thankfully, because we've been absolutely destroyed by injuries over the first couple of weeks. But this is a player that on that slow week, I am definitely going to be adding with a priority add. I think he's a player that I would burn a lot of my fab on if he is available, because I think this is a guy who has league winning type of talent if there ever were an injury to Breece Hall. And like I said, he could have some standalone value here in a couple of weeks. So that being said, Braelon Allen, he's my number one pickup on the waiver wire this week if he's there, and someone I think is definitely worth going all in to get. Now, moving on to my other running back that I want to talk about, it is going to be Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Bucks. He is rostered in about 44% of leagues, and Rachaad White has continued to look bad with the touches that he's been getting here. He's currently averaging 9.5 fantasy points per game, which is 34th in the NFL. And surprisingly enough, Bucky Irving, he is averaging a quiet 7.7 fantasy points per game, which is 37th. So they're very close together in fantasy points per game rankings at the running back position, and he is slowly eating into Rachaad White's workload more and more each and every week. I would be adding Bucky Irving if he's still available in your league to stash him and see if Tampa Bay does decide to ride the hot hand, or if they do decide to just make a switch at running back entirely here in the future. We have seen Todd Bowles come out recently as of today saying that he does feel like Bucky Irving has earned some more touches. So that alone tells me that this is something that they are talking about in the building. I think Bucky Irving needs to be picked up, and I think he's getting to the point where we can almost flex him each and every week. Now, the next running back that I want to talk about is Alexander Mattison for the Las Vegas Raiders. He is rostered in about 45% of leagues, and Alexander Mattison, he is currently averaging more fantasy points per game than Josh Jacobs and Najee Harris. And even though that's kind of crazy, and I don't fully expect that to continue over the course of the remainder of the season, I do believe that Alexander Mattison is the best running back for fantasy football purposes here in Las Vegas for the Raiders. And I think we kind of have proof of that because we're seeing him being utilized in the more valuable situations for fantasy football points. Mattison is seeing a lot more of the receiving work here than Zamir White is. He is also seeing significantly more work in the red zone, the 10 zone, and within the 5-yard line, making him more likely to get touchdowns in this offense. And I think just looking at that usage, that tells me that Alexander Mattison is being treated as the number one running back, or at least the 1A in this offense, and he is much more valuable for us in fantasy football than Zamir White is. So I'd be picking up Alexander Mattison because I think he's the running back to own here in Las Vegas. And now the last running back that I think you should pick up and stash is going to be Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's rostered in about 24% of leagues. And as I said before, I'm recording this on Monday. This is before the Monday night games, but I still think we need to be picking up Tank Bigsby, barring the fact that he doesn't get hurt here in Monday night's matchup, but I'll leave a note if something like that happens. That being said, Bigsby, he saw 12 touches in week 1, which did make him a very popular pickup going into week 2 for waivers, but he did get hurt in week 2 and he didn't really see much of the work after that. So I think a lot of people kind of just cooled off on Bigsby very quickly. He became a second thought and a lot of people kind of just dropped him right back onto the waiver wire. Now, although Tank Bigsby is still very much a dart throw, we don't really know what he is up to this point. He to me is still a player that I'm willing to stash in my fantasy football leagues because he does look like he is going to be the next man up if there were ever an injury to a guy like Travis Etienne. And if that was the case, Tank Bigsby would have quite a lot of value in fantasy football. So just because of his handcuff type of appeal and the chance that he still has a workload closer to what we saw in week 1, he's a player that I'm definitely going to try and pick up and stash off of the waivers here as we go into week 4. Now let's move over to the wide receiver position. The number one wide receiver that you can pick up is going to be Jauan Jennings for the San Francisco 49ers. He is rostered in about 44% of leagues, and let's just say he set the world on fire in week 3 of the fantasy football season. He was filling in for what felt like both Deebo Samuel and George Kittle in week 3, and he went for 46.5 PPR points there in that matchup against the Rams. So if you did pick up Jauan Jennings last week when we had him on the waiver wire show, he is a player that helped you win your week here in week 3. Now that being said, I think we need to pump the brakes just a little bit on Jauan Jennings. I've seen people talk about wanting to use a priority on him or spend a lot of fab on him. This is still a player that is very much just a short-term fill-in for the San Francisco 49ers while Deebo Samuel and George Kittle are out. Now, I understand those fantasy points, we wish that they were in our lineup. That is not going to be the norm for Jauan Jennings. This is a player who, when both Deebo and Kittle were on the football field, and when Ayuk and Deebo are on the football field, Jauan Jennings sees significantly less snaps, and he operates as the number 3 wide receiver. So, although if you need a player to pick up this week, Jauan Jennings, if he's on the waiver wire, you definitely want to prioritize him. But as I mentioned, this is very much just a 1-week fill-in for Jauan Jennings while we wait on Deebo Samuel and George Kittle. Now, moving on to another wide receiver you can pick up, let's talk about Darnell Mooney for the Atlanta Falcons. He is rostered in about 43% of leagues, and he's quietly been very productive in back-to-back weeks for the Atlanta Falcons. Mooney now has 15 targets in his last 2 games, which puts him above Kyle Pitts in the receiving pecking order here for the Atlanta Falcons, and in both of those weeks, he has finished around that wide receiver 2 range for fantasy football purposes. I think this is a player that I would be picking up and adding onto the back end of my rosters if he's available in your leagues, because Atlanta has some pretty decent matchups coming up here in the next couple of weeks against the New Orleans Saints, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Carolina Panthers, and I do believe that Darnell Mooney is going to benefit from having Drake London opposite him, especially in those tougher matchups against New Orleans and Tampa Bay, where Mooney becomes more of a second option to the defense, which could open up some more opportunities for Kirk Cousins to find him because Drake London is being covered. Now, the last wide receiver that I'm going to talk about in today's video is going to be Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys. He is currently rostered in about 11% of leagues, and it looks like Jalen Tolbert has taken over that wide receiver 2 role from Brandon Cooks in this Dallas Cowboys offense. Now, over the last 2 weeks, Tolbert has seen the same amount of targets as CeeDee Lamb in this offense, and he has 6 more total targets than Brandon Cooks in that same span. Now, additionally, in this small sample size, like I said, we're only talking week 2 and week 3, Tolbert, he is averaging 13.7 PPR fantasy points per game. It does put him in the conversation as a startable player here in our fantasy football lineups, especially if you have injuries building up on your roster, and Tolbert should should have some good matchups in 2 of his next 3 games, where he gets to play the New York Giants and the Detroit Lions, who have both given up quite a lot of fantasy points to fantasy football wide receivers. So I do think Tolbert is definitely worth a pickup and stash on our fantasy football teams. And now the last and final player we'll talk about, we'll go to the tight end position. We got to talk about Kmet of the Chicago Bears. He's currently being rostered in about 47% of leagues. In week 1, it was very annoying. We saw Gerald Everett outsnap Kmet in this Bears offense, but it does seem like that was an outlier week because Kmet has outsnapped him in both weeks 2 and weeks 3. Now Kmet, he's coming off of a very big day here in week 3. He went for 10 of 11 targets for 97 yards and a touchdown. He finished as one of the top tight ends on the week, and although 10 receptions a week is not necessarily going to be the norm for Kmet, he does have 2 very, very good matchups coming up here very soon against the Rams and the Panthers, which makes him a very good pickup and play option for the next 2 weeks, especially if you're one of these teams that has Trey McBride, who might miss some time to a concussion, Sam Laporta, who might miss some time to an ankle injury, or maybe you're just battling some other tight end injuries. Kmet is definitely a pickup and play option for us over the next couple of weeks. So there you have it. There are my top 10 players that I would be picking up and prioritizing on the waiver wire here this week. As I mentioned, if anything changes after these Monday night games, I will be making a note in the comment section, so make sure you go check that if anything major happens in these 2 games tonight. But timing wise, it just makes sense for me to continue recording these videos on Mondays. If you did like today's video, go ahead and hit that like button for me. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. And also make sure you are subscribed. That way you catch our wide receiver and our running back rankings for week 4 of the fantasy football season. Those will be coming out tomorrow. And last but not least, if you want to join our Discord, go join our Discord. It is free to join. There is no risk in doing that. And I'm in there helping you with your fantasy football teams, questions you may have about waivers, trades, start sits, any of that. I'm in there helping you with that. So like I said, free to join, no risk in doing that. Make sure you go join that. But I have nothing else for you guys today. So I will see you on our next video. But until then, peace out.